This is my 4.3 part 2. So what is qualitative data? We use qualitative data to uncover trends and patterns that may be emerging from certain subjects. This type of data is all about feelings, emotions and opinions, and normally done by asking open questions to allow us to then use follow-up questions. We can get detailed and rich data from this. Often we get lots of data, when it is qualitative, so we use coding as a way of separating and sorting lots of information in smaller and more manageable groups. There are different ways to collect qualitative data. We can conduct interviews which can be unstructured, semi-structured or structured. We can also use focus groups, questionnaires to get this data. Each of these has their own advantages and disadvantages. So the first one we're going to look at is the unstructured interview. So during unstructured interviews, the interviewer tends to spend a bit of time before starting the questions to get to know the person they're interviewing, to try and build a positive relationship and rapport with them. They will then start off by asking an open question and then letting the conversation carrying on and asking follow-up questions where possible. During the interview, the interviewee does most of the talking, and the aim is to try and get rich qualitative data. So the pros of this is that both the interviewer and interviewee are more laid back, so can build a rapport with one another. You are also more likely to get more information, as when they are relaxed, people tend to chat more easily. However, there is a risk that this information is off topic and not answering the questions that you need to. It can also be more time consuming, as you don't know how long their answers are going to be. And you also can get too much data, which can make it hard for you to analyse. So the next method is semi-structured interviews. So a semi-structured interview has some kind of structure to it. This means that the interviewer will have questions to ask, but then are flexible enough to be able to ask follow-up questions where they think is appropriate to make sure that they can get the most information. The interviewer needs to make sure that they allow enough time for the interviewee to speak, but then have the authority to stop them if their answers become irrelevant and they get off topic. The pros to this method is that it is a flexible structure, as the method is a mix of unstructured and structured. This also allows you to get relevant information, as you can point the conversation into the right direction. However, the cons of this are that the interviewee can still go off topic, and if the interviewer doesn't step in and stop them, then they could just get irrelevant data. So structured interviews have a very rigid structure, as the researcher just reads out a set of questions which, once answered, they move on straight away to the next one without asking any follow-up questions. This means that they are normally quicker and are easier to conduct because it is just the researcher reading a list of questions. The researcher also gets to choose the questions there are, which can be good for them, but it can also make them quite biased, as the researcher could then only ask questions if they know they're going to get a positive reaction out of them. Other negatives are that the interview won't flow as well due to the closed questions being asked, and there can also be a lack of detail as the interviewee is restricted by the questions asked. The researcher may get different results from what they wanted also. So now we've got the focus group. So focus group is when a small group of people get together in a room with a researcher and talk through a chosen subject to get different people's opinions. Focus groups are usually semi-structured, and it is the researcher's job to make sure the topic doesn't drift and everyone gets a chance to speak if they want to. The advantages of a focus group is that the conversation flows more naturally because there are more people, and often people feel more comfortable in a group, so will open up more in a one-to-one than in a one-to-one conversation. The research can often get more information on chosen subjects due to people's different opinions. The negatives of a focus group, however, are that sometimes you get people that are more opinionated than others, so sometimes the quieter ones may not get a chance to talk, and so the research needs to be aware of this. People can also be influenced by their peers, so may agree to something just to fit in and not what they actually think, which is called social desirability. Some people may also feel uncomfortable talking in a big group, so may not even contribute at all. So observations is another one, and how observation is carried out will affect how the people around them act, but also what data you get. So if you're a complete observer, so you don't take part in the activity, but you also don't reveal your role, then the other participants should act as normal, but may also get suspicious if they're not joining in. You do have to trust that the observer is being honest and will report what is being done truthfully and not be biased. Being a complete participant, but they don't reveal their role, will mean that they can talk more openly about issues, and the participants are more likely to talk more openly towards them because they don't know that they're being watched, so they won't try and change the way they're behaving or try and say something just to make the observer happy. When the observer is a participant and their role is revealed, the other participants around them might try and change the way they act to try and impress the observer, which will give the observer data that can't be relied on. So now into quantitative data. What is quantitative data? This is normally numerical data, and the advantages of this is that it allows research to measure and analyse data, and it's also used to test hypotheses, and it measures data using statistics. However, the disadvantages are that it doesn't always study things in their natural environment, and it gives you this data, this numerical data, but it doesn't tell you why this is, so it's not descriptive. And you also must have a large sample to do this. So a method of this is questionnaires. So questionnaires are another way of gaining information about a chosen topic. You do have to consider a few factors when making the questionnaire. For example, you have to make sure that you have enough questions so the questions are answered and you get the detail that you need. But you also have to make sure that it's not too long, as people may then not take as much care, and so you may not get very good data. So the advantages of this is that it's anonymous, structured, accessible tool, people-friendly, and reduced participant bias, and it means that you can either hand it out by email, post, or even hand out personally. The disadvantages, however, is that it's experimental bias, so they could put questions in there knowing that they're going to get the answers that they want to do. There also could be a low response rate due to people just not bothering, because if it's an email then people might just think it's spam, so just delete it straight away. And also it could be too complex if you use technical language, so you have to make sure that it's accessible for the target group that you are looking at. So observation. So for observation, the advantages of this is that you can video it to analyse it later. You can identify a team's or an individual person's strengths and weaknesses. You can show comparison and or improvement, and analyse, as I said, teams or individuals. The disadvantages, however, is that it can be time consuming. You need training and good knowledge of the sport, and the training, of course, to analyse it as well. And you may need several observers for a team, and you actually can't watch everyone at once, so you might miss things, especially in a game of basketball. If it's very fast, people are running up and down, you may miss things. And also, the participants being natural will come in the middle of both advantages and disadvantages, because if they know they're being recorded, then they might try and act differently to what they normally do to make themselves look better. However, they might be more natural if they don't know they're being recorded, so then they can't try extra hard to do the thing that they know they're not so good at. So if they don't try, then obviously they'll get more accurate results and they'll be able to work on their weaknesses more. So an experiment, so 3 things you need to consider for a true experiment is randomisation of the groups, manipulation of the independent variables, and have a control group. I have gone through this earlier about the randomisation, control group and manipulation. But for experiment, you're having a hypothesis to start with. You then go about collecting the data. You would then analyse the data and then compare it to the hypothesis to see whether or not it agrees with it or not. So this is the most popular method, and it looks at how the independent variable affects the dependent variable. So field-based experiment, there's 2 types, field-based experiment and lab-based. So field-based, the advantages of this is that it's cheaper, more accessible, and it also stimulates an actual environment, which means that there's high ecological validity, which means that you can get realistic data that you can generalise to performers. Disadvantages, however, is that it's low reliability, less variables can be controlled because you're in a natural environment, and also there's low internal validity, which is controlling the variables within the experiment. And then a lab-based experiment, the advantages of this is that the data collected is done in a controlled environment, so it means that there's a high internal validity. And also there's more control over extraneous variables, which are those that if you were, say, on a field doing something, you can't control, like the weather. If it's raining, that will be an extraneous variable because you can't control that. Whereas if you're inside in a lab, you can obviously change the altitude or the temperature. And only the independent variable affects the dependent variable. However, the disadvantages are that it's expensive equipment and training. So if you don't have access to a lab, you aren't at university, or you just don't have the ability to pay for a lab for a day, it can be very expensive. There's also low ecological validity, which means that you won't be able to generalise it to other performers. And it doesn't reflect the natural performance settings. So independent measures. You've then got different measures that you need to take into consideration. You can choose independent measures, which when different groups of individuals participate in each condition. The advantages of this is that it's easy to compare, less time consuming, and also less demand characteristics. The disadvantages, however, is that you need larger groups, so you need at least 2, which can make it more expensive. And also no person is the same, so there's individual differences between them as well. Match pairs are separate groups, which when separate groups are used, but participants are matched between one another for similar characteristics or traits. The advantages of this is that participants are only needed to complete the conditions once, so it's quicker than repeated measures. However, and they're also unlikely to get bored or tired. And there's also more external validity than in repeated measures. The disadvantages, however, is that it requires lots of participants, so it could potentially take longer to gather data, and there still will be differences between the participants even when they're matched, which could lead to lower internal validity and reliability. So repeated measures, the participants repeat their performance under different conditions. So the advantages of this is that it's less time consuming than matched pairs. It's also cheaper and can be used to see an effect over time, so can measure the same subject multiple times to get good data. The disadvantage, however, is that participants could feel fatigued or bored, which could potentially make the scores could then be changed, because their first score will probably be different to the last score if they're feeling very fatigued. And also participants could also do better due to the practice from repeating, so that could be the opposite. As they get used to the process, they then memorise that and get better. That's it.